Good morning. It's good to see everyone here this morning. This morning we continue our study titled Evolution, the War Against God. And over the last 2 weeks in this series, we have been in an introduction to the series. But this week I want us to move forward with the material into the next section where we discuss theories and consequences. When I speak of theories, I'm talking about different aspects, different specific aspects of the theory of evolution, as well as the consequences that happen biblically and in our world if we do believe these theories. And so this morning we are going to start by looking at some of these theories. You know, since the beginning, man has sought to remove God as creator. They have sought to remove God from His throne. You go back to Genesis chapter 3 and the fall of man. One of the reasons that Adam and Eve ate of the fruit was not only because it looked good, but because they wanted to be like God. We fast forward to the time of the flood, Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Did humanity learn anything from the Garden of Eden and being expelled from it? No, they did not. In fact, evil and idolatry had taken over the world to the point that God said He even regretted making man in the first place. And so God destroys everything on earth except for some of the animals to continue those species and 8 human beings. Now you would think a global flood would be enough to get humanity's attention. But it wasn't. If you follow the biblical chronology, the flood happened approximately 24 to 2500 BC, give or take. By the time we reach Abraham, approximately 2100 BC, had man learned their lesson? No, not at all. It only took 300 to 400 years for man to return to their idolatry after the flood. How do we know this? Well, you look at Joshua 24, 14, and 15, a text that shares with us what Joshua told the children of Israel before they were going to enter the promised land. He says in verse 14 of Joshua 24, "Therefore fear the Lord and worship Him in sincerity and truth. Get rid of the gods your fathers worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt and worship the Lord. But if it doesn't please you to worship the Lord, choose for yourselves today. Which will you worship? The gods your fathers worshiped beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living? As for me and my family, we will worship the Lord." As I said, these are the words that were given to the Israelites before they entered the promised land. And Joshua says, listen, you have to make a choice. You're either going to serve the one true God, or you're going to serve the gods of your ancestors beyond the Euphrates River, or you're going to adopt the culture and religion and customs of the Amorites, of the people that live around you. Now, what does this say about the idolatry of the time of Abraham? Well, go back and notice what he says here. Twice, once in 14 and once in 15, he refers to the gods your fathers worshiped beyond the Euphrates River. Where is that? It's the Fertile Crescent. That's Mesopotamia. That's where Abraham came from, Ur of the Chaldees. Yes, folks, it only took 300 to 400 years before, even after God wiped out almost all living things, 300 to 400 years later, they're right back at it, trying to dethrone God. And has humanity learned anything after this? Well, no. Let's fast forward about 800 to 900 years of human history. We're roughly around 1200 BC at this point, the time of the Judges, what historians refer to as the Bronze Age collapse. And notice what the last 2 verses in Judges say. It says, "And the people of Israel departed from there, at that time every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." At that point, there was no king, no ruler, no authority. None whatsoever. And we know where this is going. You know, by the time we get to 1 Samuel chapter 8, the Israelites, the leaders of the Israelites, they come to Samuel and they say, Samuel, we want a king. We want to be like all the other nations. We demand that you give us a king. And Samuel obviously was very disturbed by this. And so he goes to God and says, God, I don't know what to do. They won't listen to me. I've told them they don't need a king, but they won't listen. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 7 and 8, God responds to Samuel and he says, listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you, they have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of the land of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. God says, they're doing the same thing they've always done. Nothing's changed. They still want to dethrone God. They still want to abandon God and worship false deities. You know, this whole idea of, no king, no ruler. God is taken off His throne may sound like a good idea to some people in our culture. But what does the Bible say about this? Proverbs 14:12 says, there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Folks, this is where we are as a society today. God is dethroned by many. Well, they dethrone Him in their minds at least. People want to dethrone God. They want to remove God from His place of kingship and being ruler and the authority over them in their lives. Now, folks, that's what evolution is all about. Removing the God of the Bible. Because once the Creator is removed, once God the Creator is removed, then there's no lawgiver and there's no judge and there's no accountability. So man can do whatever he pleases without any judgment, without any guilt, without any apprehension or accountability whatsoever. Yet we as Christians, we know what's really going on here. We understand what's really happening. We understand that there will come a day in which God will judge both the living and the dead. Paul spoke about this in Acts 17, 30 and 31 to those Epicurean and Stoic philosophers at Mars Hill. He says, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now He commands all people everywhere to repent, because He has fixed a day in which He will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom He has appointed. And of this He has given assurance to all by raising Him from the dead. Folks, we understand what's at stake here. The souls of people are at stake. This is not some theoretical argument. This is not some hyperbolous argument or hypothetical idea. This is reality. What we are battling when we reject evolution and hold to God's Word is a battle for the souls of people. As Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, in verses 10 and 11, he said, we all must stand before the judgment seat of Christ so that each one may receive what he has done in this life, whether good or evil. He goes on to say in verse 11, therefore, knowing the fear or terror, some translations say, of the Lord, we persuade men. We understand what's at stake. And so this is something we need to know about. It's something that we need to have some level of understanding about, so we can teach, so we can allow people to learn the truth. Now, in our first lesson, I said this is not going to be a scientific lecture. And that's not my approach with this lesson. But here's the harsh reality of the facts in this matter. If you sit down with someone and want to, and they understand evolution, you sit down with them and you say, well, the Bible says this here. That's not going to cut it. We need to have at least some level of understanding of what evolution is and how to combat it. You see, when it comes to evolution, folks, there are really two types of evolution. There's naturalistic evolution, and there is theistic evolution. We're going to talk about theistic evolution next week. But this week, let's talk about naturalistic evolution. You know, we've thrown around several terms already in our introduction. Let's become a little bit more familiar with what this is so we can better combat it in the world. So, theistic evolution, naturalistic evolution is defined as the process by which different kinds of living organisms are believed to have developed from earlier forms during the history of the earth. That's pretty self-explanatory. Naturalistic evolution is the idea that everything in this world evolved over millions and billions of years, that some creatures evolved into completely different kinds of creatures. I'd say the weirdest one that I've heard thus far in reading up on evolution is the idea that whales came on land, sprouted legs over millions and billions of years, and became our modern-day cow. I kid you not. It's ridiculous. But people believe this stuff. Naturalistic evolution is the idea that every living organism developed and evolved over time into its current form. Darwin had a shorter way of looking at this. He referred to it as natural selection, the survival of the fittest. Now, this doesn't mean in evolutionary theory that the strongest survived or the most intelligent survived, but the one that could adapt. The most fit would be the one that survived. A staunch atheist, Leon C. Migginson is his name, in a lecture he gave at the Louisiana State University in 1963. He says, quote, "It is not the most intellectual of species that survives. It is not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one that is able to best adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself." Now, folks, it's at this point we need to stop and have a discussion about the difference between adaptation and evolution. And there is a very stark difference between the two. And this is divided, if you read scientific books or you listen to people who discuss evolution, they divide this into two areas. There's microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is adaptation. Microevolution is defined as the evolution that occurs at or below the level of species, such as a change in the gene frequency of a population or organisms, or the process by which new species are created, speciation. We'll talk about that in a second. Macroevolutionary changes may be due to several processes: mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. So basically, what microevolution is, folks, is adaptation. Plain and simple. You say, well, how can you say it's just adaptation? It says a process by which new species are created. That sounds like big boy evolution to me. Well, no, they specify speciation. Speciation is just a word that means a variation within a species. I'll give you a great example. You go to the Duluth Zoo, and they have the American bobcat. You go a little further down the exhibit, you see the Canadian bobcat. Same species, but a variation within that species where the animals have adapted to their surroundings. And what's interesting about this, and the reason why this is important, is there is a huge difference between adaptation and evolution. There is a huge difference between what some people will refer to as microevolution. I don't like to call it that because it gives evolution credit for what God has done, frankly. There's a huge difference between microevolution and macroevolution. Let me show you what I mean here. There are three examples that I'll give you with corresponding quotes. So, an example of microevolution or adaptation are sparrows in North America. It says, I ran across this quote from one scientist. They say house sparrows were introduced to North America in 1852. Since then, these sparrows have become smaller based upon their location. Sparrow populations in the north have larger bodies than sparrow populations in the south. This divergence in population is primarily the result of adaptation. Larger-bodied birds can often survive lower temperatures than smaller-bodied birds. Therefore, the only sparrows to survive the harsh northern winters and pass on their genes are the larger-bodied sparrows. Simply put, and we see this even up here in different types of creatures in nature, The only ones that actually survive a harsh northern Wisconsin winter are the ones that are larger body. And so the only ones that are still in the gene pool come the next winter are those that have a larger body. I'll give you another example of microevolution or adaptation. That's the white-tailed deer. This is something that I noticed from, I would say, my very first fall up here. So in Louisiana, their deer are fairly small. Back down there, they think a 100-pound doe is a big doe. Up here, that's a slow Tuesday. I could hunt with a rifle chambered in .556 in Louisiana. You can't do that up here. If you use a .556 to hunt deer in northern Wisconsin, you're either going to wound them severely and they're probably not going to die and be picked off by wolves, or they're going to look back and say, oh, what was that prick? You know, it's just not going to work. You can't take them because they're too large. And it's interesting, about this very idea, a scientist said, quote, "The female doe in North America usually weighs from 88 to 198 pounds. White-tailed deer from the tropics and the Florida Keys are markedly smaller bodied than temperate populations, averaging 77 to 110 pounds, with an occasional adult female as small as 55 pounds. Now, folks, this is not macroevolution. This is not evolution as what one would think of when we think about the idea of evolution, what we're talking about in this series. This is an adaptation. That's it. This is where the larger-bodied animals can actually survive the winter, and so they're able to pass on their genes. The coolest example of adaptation is West African frogs. And I have to give Becky credit for this one, bringing this one to my attention, because she had frogs at one point, and she saw this happen with her tadpoles. West African frogs, folks, can change their gender based upon the ratio of male to female within an environment. In fact, this one scientist says, female green frogs have two X chromosomes, whereas males have an X and Y have an X and Y. Sorry, I don't know why I got tripped up on that. The researchers found that males outnumbered females in all but one of the 18 ponds they studied. In 7 of the ponds, they found genotypically female frogs that had developed as males. And in 8, they noticed genetically male frogs that developed as females. The proportion of sex-reversed animals was generally below 5%, but peaked at 10% in one pond. In other words, God gave this species an adaptation to where if it is in a single-sex environment, a certain number of them can change from male to female depending on the ratio to prolong the species. Folks, that's not evolution. That's the work of God. This is not something evolving over millions and billions of years. This is an adaptation that God created in nature. This is not millions and billions of years. This isn't something that, some scientists can look at and say, well, if we waited longer, maybe these frogs would become snakes even. No, same species, but variation within the species. That's microevolution. That's on the small scale. That is, I like to use the word adaptation. On the other hand, macroevolution, evolution in the sense that we think of it when we think about the theory of evolution, is defined as the evolution that occurs above the level of species, such as the origin of new designs, feathers, vertebrates from invertebrates, jaws in fish, large-scale events, extinction of dinosaurs, broad trends, increased brain size in mammals, and major transitions, origin of higher-level life forms. So basically, microevolution is nothing more than adaptation within the species, not going from one species to another. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is, well, this whale is going to become a cow one day. We just got to wait a few billion years to see it happen. And folks, that's just simply not the case. Evolution is impossible. It can't happen. And there are several reasons on a scientific scale as to why it cannot happen. First of all, let's talk about Newton's first law of thermodynamics. And like I said, I'm not trying to turn this into a science lecture, but if you sit down and you have a conversation with someone that actually knows about evolution, This is information you're going to need to not have them just simply walk away and not pay attention. You want to engage them in serious conversation. These are things that are essential. Because science itself disproves the theory of evolution. Newton's first law of thermodynamics, often referred to as the law of the conservation of energy and matter, states, energy can be converted from one form to another with the interaction of heat, work, and internal energy. It cannot be created or destroyed under any circumstance. Now, there's two practical applications that I can think of to help us understand this law of thermodynamics, this idea that energy and matter can either be created or destroyed. Two examples. First one is your car's engine. When you start your car, what happens to your engine? It starts to warm up. Why does it do that? Well, you have your fuel that is hit by a catalyst, your spark plug, and then that releases energy into your engine, turns your pistons. And since your engine is not 100% efficient, what is the output? Thermal energy, heat. So your car engine is a perfect example of Newton's first law of thermodynamics. That energy cannot be created or destroyed. It has to be transferred. So instead of it just going off somewhere, no, it becomes heat, energy. The other way to think about this is in terms of matter. Matter can either be created or destroyed. You can shrink an item down, but it has to retain its mass. So I'll give you an old school and new school reference. So back in the day, if my memory serves me correct, the Jetsons, in their little intro, Mr. Jetson, he's got his car. He gets to work, and his car folds up into this little briefcase, and he picks it up and he walks into work. Okay, well that violates the first law of thermodynamics because your mass cannot change. You can shrink it down, but it's still going to weigh just as much as what it did when it was in its full form. Another way to think of this, I guess a more new school reference, if any of you have seen the movies Avengers Endgame or Avengers Infinity War, Tony Stark, Iron Man, he's got this little thing on his chest, and if he taps it, his suit comes out of it. He calls it nanoparticles. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Stark and Marvel, that violates the first law of thermodynamics. Because even if he could fit it all in there, it would have to have the same mass when it's out over his body as it does when it's in his little housing that he built. You say, how does all this relate to evolution? Well, folks, the idea that evolutionists propagate is the idea that at the Big Bang, everything came into existence. Well, let's stop and think about this in light of Newton's first law of thermodynamics. Let's think about that energy. Where did the energy to create the universe originate? Where did it come from? It can't be created or destroyed, so where did it come from? The energy had to originate from somewhere, right? And what blows my mind even more is how this equates to matter. Matter can either be created or destroyed. The mass of an object has to stay the same. You mean to tell me all the planets and all the stars, everything from a black hole to a dwarf planet to Earth and everything on it, that at the Big Bang it had all that mass right here? No, when you look at evolution and what they say happened at the Big Bang, it's a total violation of the laws of physics. The energy had to come from somewhere. The matter had to come from somewhere. But they say, well, it's kind of like a quote. I think we looked at it last week. I can't remember who said it, but they said, well, the creation of the universe, the Big Bang is just something, it happens from time to time. It's all an accident. Well, no, it's non-existent because it violates the first law of thermodynamics. The second reason evolution is impossible, building right on this point, is the second law of thermodynamics. Sometimes referred to as the law of entropy, the law of chaos. It states, the state of entropy, that is chaos in the entire universe as an isolated system, will always increase over time. The second law also states that the changes in entropy in the universe can never be negative. In other words, it can never decrease the entropy. It can never decrease the chaos. Basically, what this is saying is that everything in our universe is going from a state of order to disorder, from organization to chaos. Plain and simple. Everything in our universe is on a downward spiral. So the evolutionist comes along and they say, well, you know, all this stuff evolved upward. Explain to me how that works in light of Newton's second law of thermodynamics. How can things evolve upward when the laws of physics dictate everything has to go down and degrade over time? Think about it this way in light of the creation. It says here that this is in an isolated system or a closed system. So God exists outside of space and time. He created everything in the universe. After creation, after the 6 literal days of creation, and God rests on the 7th, we know how this goes. We exist in a closed system. And when sin entered the world in Genesis 3, as we'll talk more about next week, Romans 5 discusses how this works in a bit more detail. But once sin enters the world, the creation is in a fallen state. It is no longer very good. Thus, the law of entropy is enacted and everything is in a state of constant degradation over and over. Now, folks, if there is one law of physics that should destroy the argument of the evolutionist, I mean, yes, we can look at the first law of thermodynamics, but the second law, the law of entropy, this should end the debate. But it's as I believe John MacArthur in one of his books, he wrote, if you love your sin enough, you'll do anything. Someone might say, well, you know, microevolution, you know, adaptation is possible, but, you know, why is macroevolution not possible? You know, we just need to wait a few million or billion years. Couldn't that be possible? Well, no. You see, in addition to Newton's first 2 laws of thermodynamics, there's another law of physics. Actually, it's not physics. It's a law concerning genetics. And before we talk about this, let me explain where I'm coming from. When you go back and read The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, he even states in his book that he is judging things based upon their appearance. So he can look at an ape and say, well, that looks pretty similar to a human, so humans must have evolved from apes. This is the same argument that people give about dinosaurs evolving into modern-day chickens, because they have a hip bone that's turned backwards and all these different similarities with bone structure. So they say, oh, well, we don't really have any proof that there's a link here, but we're just going to assume that dinosaurs eventually evolved into chickens because this is how they look. We know from modern science that this is absolutely absurd. And one of the ways we know this is what's called genetic information theory. Information theory talks about the sharing of data. And when it's applied to genetics, it blows the argument of evolution out of the water. Gene theory is the idea that genes are the basic units in which characteristics are passed from one generation to the next. Genes themselves are the basic units of heredity. The gene theory provides the basis for understanding how genes enable parents to transmit traits to their offspring. It is also a key element in the study of genetics. Simply put, folks, genetic information theory says everything that is living has a genetic code. And it has its genetic code to do whatever it was designed to do, and that's it. One author I like to read on this, I've got a couple of his books. His name is A.E. Wilder Smith. And in one of the books that I was reading that he wrote, his book entitled, let's see here. Let me get the title here for you. Scroll down in my notes. There we go. Yeah, in his book, The Scientific Alternatives to Neo-Darwin Evolutionary Theory, that's kind of a mouthful, but it's a very, very good book. If you want to know more about genetics and how that teaches against evolution, Wilder Smith is a very good author. He is a geneticist. And he writes in his book, he says, Darwin's so-called gradualism postulated in the last analysis that all forms of biology are derived from a single, simple cell. Keep that in mind. That's important here in a minute. derived from a simple single cell, which, by an unbroken series of small gradualistic changes, gave rise to an unbroken chain of steps from the original cell up to man himself. And biology was strictly continuous. So, in a nutshell, in this first quotation, what Wilder Smith is saying is that everything in life originated from this one single cell, and that this single cell gained all this other information by itself to create life, even up to our own human existence today, our human form today. But he goes on to say about this, he says, there is one great aspect of reality about which Darwin, and indeed everyone of his epoch, knew nothing. I'm referring to the modern science of information theory. For if a primeval kind of amoeba is to develop up to a primate, that primeval cell, speaking of that single cell earlier, that primeval cell will have to gather all sorts of new information on how to make kidneys, livers, four-chambered hearts, cerebra, and cerebella, end quote. In a nutshell, what Wilder Smith is saying is that if that amoeba, if that single-celled organism wants to develop into every living creature, it's got to gain more information. It's got to gain information it does not have within itself. Folks, this is one of the greatest fallacies of evolution. The idea that you can change your genetics, that you can change your genetic code. Yes, you can mutate downward, that's right. A baby's not going to be born with the powers of Captain America. If a baby has a genetic mutation, it's usually not good. Because a mutation happens, it can only happen downward. And what Wilder Smith is saying is that this idea that this single-celled organism created everything came from that single-celled organism, is a farce, because that single cell does not have the information to make a human, a dog, a bird. A human has the genetic code to be a human and nothing else. A dog has the genetic code to be a dog and nothing else. A bird has the genetic code to be a bird and nothing else. Think about it this way. This computer that's sitting up here on the podium, it has the code within it to run Windows 10. Now, if I let this computer sit here for several, let's say, billion years, is it going to miraculously develop the code within it to become a Linux operating system? Yeah, Russ, you can roll your eyes. It's okay. Yeah. No, it's not. And the same is true with every life form on this planet. You can't do it. It is impossible. It is impossible because living creatures only have the genetic code within them to do what God has designed them to do. The only time a mutation happens, it has to always be downward, never upward. I'll close like this. I want to close by reading part of the passage that David read for us this morning. And this is from Genesis 1:11 through 13. And I actually pulled this from the Koran Jerusalem Bible. This is a Hebrew translation of the Old Testament and is probably one of the more accurate ones that we have. And they translate this text in Genesis 1:11 through 13 as, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, herb yielding seed, and fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, those seeds, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, herb yielding seed after its kind, and tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the third day." There is a phrase in this text that is used 3 times I want to draw your attention to. And it's the phrase "after its kind," or in some translations, "according to its kind." When you look at this word for kind in the Hebrew, it is the word min, or min in Hebrew. It can be translated as kind. More specifically, it is translated as species. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the New Testament, this would have been the Old Testament read by the first century church, because that's all they had, and everyone pretty much read Greek. They use the Greek word genos, where we get our word for genus, or species. What this means is when God created, He created everything to be after its species, after its kind. Folks, in addition to science, when we come to God's Word, we find there is no allowance for evolution. Plain and simple. When God created living things, He created them to be after their kind, after their genus, after their species. You do not see one type of animal evolving into something completely different. Why? Because God created it to procreate after its own kind. Not something else, not going from one species to another, but after its own genus, after its own species. Someone might say, well, preacher, don't you know there are Christians that don't really believe this. They believe there's a cohesion between the Bible and evolution. Well, what fellowship does light have with darkness? What fellowship does a theory that wants to remove God have with the idea that God is sovereign and the ruler and the ultimate authority? But that's a conversation that we will have next week. So with that, the lesson is yours this morning.